I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to open up for questions from the audience. You know, I got here, I'm dating myself, in 1974. I'd go anywhere and there were no Asians. Much, you know, and there was a black population here, there was a Native American population here, but not much else. Now, 70% of the kids in both the St. Paul and Minneapolis school system are kids of color. There are, I can't know what the exact number of first languages are, but I know just in the junior high my kids went through, there were 35 first languages. And, you know, there have been so many ways in which the traditional dialogue on race in America has been a black-white dialogue. And as we're talking about issues we wanted to talk about for the panel, one of the things we wanted to talk about was intersectionality, and also not just in terms of people of color talking to each other, but also within our own populations, the GBLT community, and issues arising out of that, issues arising out of women's issues. And it's like, the question, I'm just, you know, how do we work on increasing the communication between our communities and within our communities about all these issues, and about how we as people of color relate to each other. I'm going to ask Guante to speak on this first. I got to play the teacher here and go, Guante, you haven't said anything, okay.
I mean, I can't speak to others' hesitation. My hesitation is because I don't know if it's my question to answer, right? Like, I identify as mixed, but I also identify as someone who walks down the street as a white person, and who maybe more appropriately stands on a stage as someone who reads as white. So I won't speak to the specifics of how different communities of color can obviously like interact with each other, but I will say, I think one thing that we talked today about at the conference with all the people is just the importance of like showing up. Again, a really, really practical thing, but I think a really, really important thing that I know I myself forget sometimes. And I try to constantly remind myself to show up, physically go places and be places. And also not just the literal showing up, but also kind of the deeper sense of showing up. Yeah.
There's an anthology that was written a while ago that has a title that always sticks with me, right? That talks about how all the women are white, all the blacks are male, but some of us are brave, right? So one, that we have a hard time having conversations about intersectionality, right? That we're walking in multiple identities, right? And we have a hard time really having some conversations about coalitional politics and what that might mean, right? So one, generally, like in race conversations, I'll kind of state like how I enter these conversations. One is that I am less interested in doing the work of educating white folk, right? I don't feel like that's my work. I'm not gonna do that work, especially because most times I'm asked to do that work, I'm asked to do it for free. The other, I'm invested though in how we have conversations about race that aren't centering on whiteness, right? And how do we have conversations, particularly amongst communities of color and indigenous communities, that look at nuances, right? That I don't think, even in the conversation of talking about blackness, that I see much of, if any, nuance surrounding how we talk about that, right? That so when we're talking about black folks, are we including Afro-Latinos? Do folks like my kids who are black but also have Chinese heritage? Like, do they, which might not be read as black but have African ancestry? Like, how is it that we talk about the scope of blackness as an orientation, right? Are black trans and queer folk a part of that conversation? Are we talking about simply, especially like when it's talking about like issues that are related to violence against particular bodies, are we just talking about black cisgender heterosexual men, right? As a starting point or a point of departure for liberation, right? So that's a problem. So I feel like intersectionality means in these kinds of conversations that move us to a place where we're actually dealing with like coalitional politics and building in ways means that we gotta slow down in some ways. I feel like I have to like practice listening often, you know, that language surrounding, like I think that language that is larger language shouldn't just be used interchangeably, you know? So that if we're talking about folks of color, but we're just identifying issues within a black-white binary, then I think that that's a problem, you know? And that doesn't do anybody any good, right? So those kinds of essentialisms and narrowing of the spectrum is problem. It's a problem. Like, and so I feel like we have to have like harder conversations, and I think that requires smaller rooms and probably a lot more questions and more time. You know, so those are some things on my mind. I keep on passing the mic. Y'all got a mic.
Go through.
I agree. Yeah, I do. You know, when we were talking to some of the young people today, we were emphasizing, this is the same thing that Sean and everyone else is saying, but relationship building, you know, like really thinking about ourselves in relationship to one another is important. And then really thinking about ourselves. So thinking about, intersectionality in terms of one's own, like, individual body sort of identity politics and things, but also thinking about ourselves in relationship to one another. And thinking about that body of selves that are in relationship to one another, in relationship to, you know, the system that is white supremacist, patriarchal, booedness. I made that word up just now. Booedness. You know what I mean? So I agree. I concur. I think that's the word.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be cool if like people of other cultures like invited me to things. I don't know. Like, I guess like my thing is like, for me, I feel like, and like, I'm not saying that I don't get invited to things about like other cultures, but like for me, it's like, I feel like I'm invading a space if I wasn't invited into a space. So I think it's like, we as people remembering to invite people who aren't just like us to events that we enjoy, or like events that are our space, in order to build that like cultural gap. Because I feel like a lot of times we kind of just like ease into, or like are comfortable with people who look like us, talk like us, act like us. But if we branch out and like, you might be my friend, but like, why didn't I think to invite you to the Reverb open mic on Thursday nights, you know? Like, that's just like reaching out and inviting your friends who like don't look like you or act like you or talk like you to the spaces that you will be at, you know? I guess.
There's a learning that has to happen also. Like, there's a learning that has to happen. You know, assimilation is real. Forgetting is real. Being forced to forget is real. And it would be fun to relearn and unlearn. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about being in relationship with one another. You know, because so, you know, in this was also part of the critique of the whole button poetry thing. Is like a self-articulated, I don't know how to be in a relationship, or we may not know how to work with folks of color in this capacity, but you know, that's a really interesting thing. So like, what the work of being, of working, the work of being in relationship with, and what does it mean to step into a space that is outside of your norm, and how do you respect that space, and how do you not inflict wounds, and how do you not disrespect, and etc. So it's like, that's part of it as well, you know what I mean? And like, what spaces, and then what other work do we need to do? Because it's also not anyone else's job to make you feel any kind of a way. Like, I am not supposed to make you feel comfortable here. I'm about to talk this black woman shit right now, and if you don't like it, oops, you know what I'm saying? Oh, what? That's, you know, that's your bad. So what work do you need to do for yourself when you're coming into a black space to feel like, or into any space, right? But I'm using this. This is my body. I'm using this example. So if you come into my black ass space and I'm talking black shit, how do you know what do you need to do to not feel like, and not take it personal, because it has absolutely nothing to do with you and everything to do with this. Straight up. So like, in any given situation. So it's so complex, and we're so complex. And how do we honor the complexities of our existence? Like, you know, yeah.
I would just say a couple things. One is just live with discomfort. Live with fears. You know, and put your spaces in places where you're uncomfortable, and just deal with it. The other thing I'll say is, you know, I mean, I look at friends and students that I have now, and they're from places in the globe. When I was growing up, I didn't even think about. You know, I have friends and students from, you know, Nigeria, Dominican Republic, Sri Lanka, Palestine. When I was growing up, I didn't think about those things, and I find like I'm constantly running up against my own ignorance, and I'm constantly feeling like I have to educate myself. And I think that's one of the great things about being an artist, is you're curious about the world, and you keep learning about the world, and the more you learn about the world, the more interesting the world is. And I'm running, and I will never keep up. I will never know enough. And I always will run into my own ignorance. And when I run into my own ignorance, it's just like, yeah, fuck, I didn't know about that shit. You know, maybe I should have known about that shit, but I don't. So I better learn about that shit. You know?